this computer. Fantastic. We might have another couple of people coming along, but I think we should get started. So we're really happy to have Branden Ingram here today, giving the first Shocklab talk in a little while. Branden was a PhD student at VITS in the Rail Lab, where he is calling in from today, where he has transitioned from a student now to a lecturer there, where he's one of the principal leads, I guess, at the Rail Lab these days. He did his work in the same theme that he's going to be talking about today, in terms of understanding sort of behavior in gameplay. And we're very, very happy to have him talk today about generating tailored advice in video games through playstyle identification and player modeling. Over to you.
Thank you. It's a bit of a mouthful, made up of lots of different components that hopefully we can get through today. I also appreciate the introduction. I don't know if I would say principled member just yet, but perhaps that's my my studentness that I still need to rub off a bit. But yeah, cool. So as was mentioned, this is my like a summary of like my PhD research that I recently finished. I guess the end of last year I finished it. And I'm going to be talking to everyone here, going through all that good stuff. But first, I just wanted to add a few things about me. So I've always had like a huge passion for video games, and then I got into computer science and IT, I guess, initially, and I enjoyed programming. And I always wanted to know or strive to marry these two components, like what became like machine learning research, those types of things with video games. And that was what inspired what I'm going to be talking to you guys about now. And I just thought I'd show like a little image of like where we come from. This is members of the Rail Lab as of this year. It's getting to be quite a big group of people. And yeah, as mentioned, Prof. Benjamin Rossman, who, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but in the middle and the bottom row, was my supervisor, and kind of was what introduced me to this lab, and definitely served as like a mentor into becoming more and more an academic. Anyway, that is a little bit about background. I'm going to briefly go through a bit of the motivation behind what we eventually came to, call this project. And it centers around like a few different ideas. The first one is that, learning is a complex process. And, whether that's like a machine trying to learn or a human trying to learn, it's quite a complex, unintuitive process. So that was like one of the key tenets that we wanted to try work with. And the second one is that teaching is a harder thing, right? If we can figure out learning, well, we still have to figure out how to teach someone. And this was like a loosely the motivation behind the research. And, as the title says, we try to generate tailored advice. And then the other aspect of it was in terms of like video games. I'm sure if you played a video game or used any form of software really, there are these built-in tutorial systems. However, they quickly become redundant if, are useful at all. But they're not like tailored to specific users. So this was one of the things that we were trying to figure out, like how can we design maybe a curriculum, if you want to think of it like that, that was tailored to a specific user. Now, to like expand on this idea a little bit, I just want to frame it in terms of this quite popular game that I really enjoy called Spelunky. And in Spelunky here, you are an intrepid explorer trying to, navigate through a world, a complex world that is, in order to collect treasure, rescue people, slay monsters, and ultimately escape. Now, as I was walking you through that, there were all these different like sub goals, if you want to call them like that. But, I might have a certain preference towards a set of sub goals, and you might have a completely different set of preferences. And it is these preferences that we would like to leverage. So, in recent years, there's been like a lot of success in using machine learning and reinforcement learning techniques, such as OpenAI in Dota 2, and AlphaStar in StarCraft. I actually wanted to do my research in StarCraft, and like the year after I registered, or like a couple months after I registered for my PhD, then the DeepMind paper came out, and I was like, okay, well, I've got to think of something else and move on from that one. But the point is that, you know, there has been, in somewhat recent years, a massive step forward in terms of the complexity of the problems that we can solve with various machine learning methods. The one issue with like RL in particular, or, you know, machine learning in general, is that how models are trained is, you know, in order to generate some sort of sequence of optimal actions. You know, so given a state, what is the optimal action to do in this state? And you do that for every single state, right? Now, I know there's option frameworks and all of this, but that's just like an abstraction of that same idea. The issue with this is, you know, sure, given this like environment, and maybe the model says, oh, I should go right here, it's not the most intuitive. And when it comes to creating systems that can, you know, develop or help you get better, you being like a human, not a machine, you need to utilize a far more intuitive, you know, set of instructions. So in that sense, we require a way to learn based on your personal preferences. And like I mentioned before, maybe your preference is to, you know, rescue some of the characters in the world that are now lost, or you have a preference to, you know, finding and hunting and slaying monsters in this like dungeon-like world. And you know, these could be considered like your personal style of play, or your play style. You know, and often in literature, these are labeled, or you try to identify a particular label to associate with a person. So, you know, maybe you're a hero or a monster hunter, or something like that. Again, in literature, it doesn't tend to go much further than that. Some naive statistical analysis has been done to help describe what like a hero is and what a monster hunter is, or some of the other terms are like completionist or explorer and these types of things, but somewhat unsatisfactory, at least in my own mind. But in general, this is like the motivation. How can we learn to identify unique characteristics of individuals such that they can be leveraged to help them get better quicker, to like increase their learning rates? So my research that I proposed many years ago now was an approach to solving this problem. Like, how can we generate tailored advice, so advice specific to a particular user, through playstyle identification and player modeling. And specifically, we looked into video game environments. Again, that was one of my passions. But we hope maybe one day that we can expand this to just general forms of education. Okay. So that the whole research essentially culminated on figuring out this diagram, or creating this diagram. This is our complete pipeline, or our overall approach. And it's fairly complex, but it's made up of very simple ingredients, I think. The four main components that I'll be going through and breaking down today, that formed like my 4 individual chapters in my PhD, were playstyle identifier, or playstyle identification. And at least from my brief talks, this is maybe the thing that you might be most interested in: the game modeler, player modeler, and the actual advisor at the end of the day. And, you know, just before I get into it all, what I want you to understand is that this model works in both an online and offline fashion. So we required a data set of trajectories, or a data set of, you know, player experiences that was used to do a lot of the pre-training. And then during online play, because we want this to be adaptable to, you know, specific users while they're playing, then there's like a separate stream of processing that happens. But in general, this is the whole program or the whole approach. 3 components that talk to each other and solve individual problems that all feed into the advisor, which then formulates and schedules advice. Cool. I am very happy to take questions as we go along. So just stop me, interrupt me, and we can answer the questions there and then. But otherwise, at the end.
Sorry, Branden. Sorry, Branden.
Yeah.
So is this like, which game is this for? Is this for a particular game or?
Yeah. So I'll get into the domains that we tested on. I think it's the next slide. Bam, just like that. You see, just one step ahead of me there. But yeah, so we tested this on a couple different environments. The first one is a grid world domain that we created, where it's a very simple thing. You have a start, a set of goals. There's some locations where you would die, that type of thing. And we created this data set or this environment, to fine tune and test if our model was actually doing what we expected it to do. And then we applied it to 2 more like real world domains, shall we call it, in video game space, of course. The one is mini dungeons, which is the environment on the right-hand side here. Again, like a more realistic dungeon crawler. There's treasure to collect, monsters to slay, potions, and all these good things to find. And then we also applied it to Super Mario Brothers. And particularly with Super Mario Brothers, we had a human-generated set of data. So here there were recorded experiences from human players. These other 2 environments, we use synthetic/simulated data as part of our data sets. So these were the environments that we tested upon, with ranging observation and action spaces to, just to be considerate of like complexity and generalizability to more complex domains. It is hoped in the future again that we could apply this to even further or more complex domains, maybe the Atari environments and such like that. But as of yet, we have not. Cool. Just to expand on what like our data was made up of, essentially we created data sets of trajectories. And here a trajectory is just like a sequence of states. So the other terminology I just want to make clear is that we work with full trajectories, which have like a start and like a terminal or final state. And there'll be some like intermediate states in between. And these states or these like intermediate time steps are represented by the states of the game. So if you think of Super Mario Brothers, there's a set of features that describe the states. And likewise for all the other environments. And then the only other thing is like we also worked with partial trajectories, which are just like subsequences of a full trajectory. Nothing more complex than that. But why that was important, I'll get into why that is important a little bit later. Cool. So this is just like a little precursor, just to understand what we're going with. Now I'm going to break down the individual components. So the first and I think most important one is the playstyle identification process. Okay, and here we look to solve the problem of what are the different ways to play the game. So what are the different playstyles that are represented by what we hope is a comprehensive initial training set or training set of trajectories. There can be arguments that there's potential that these data sets didn't conclusively contain examples for all possible playstyles, but we think we were quite robust to that fact. Okay, so the general, very simple process is that we create or collect or simulate a large set of trajectories, which then feed through our playstyle identification model. And what we really want to get out of this is a label for each of the trajectories as well as some sort of interpretable description for that playstyle. And this was achieved in a 2-part process. But formally, this process can be represented as follows. Given a set of trajectories X, can we identify a label Y that categorizes each trajectory according to a unique style of play? Now, this, can be thought of as your very standard supervised learning, methodology. Given X, what is Y? This type of thing, or given X and a Y, what is F? But although we had playstyle labels in our 2 synthetic data sets, obviously in real world games, you won't have a label, that categorizes a person's playstyle. So we employed an unsupervised approach to this, which made use of clustering. However, the one issue with these types of inputs is that trajectories can be like varying length, multi-dimensional time steps, and these issues don't play nice when it comes to clustering. Right, so traditional clustering techniques like k-means or GMM or dbScan, they really like to have uniform data dimensions, like a single vector or a set of vectors, and you cluster those.
Can I just ask?
Yeah,
I just ask a quick question there based on a similar, thought? Was the idea to look at sort of single timescale types of behavior? Because I can imagine that behavior at the sort of moment to moment, how quickly you move, you press the button in a given situation, that could define a play style, but also long-term trajectories could define a play style. Were you looking at the whole sort of hierarchy or just one in particular?
So I think that's definitely important. A lot of the time, at least from the literature I've seen, is that they will cluster on like metadata, like summaries of trajectories or particular time steps, right? So, how did a player play over the entire, playthrough? Like, how long did they play for? How many quests? All of these types of things, or they'll cluster a particular state. And I think rightfully, as you mentioned, that is somewhat limiting, right? Your playstyle can emerge as a result of a sequence of states, right, over your history. So we looked to cluster based on this history. And then just to elaborate on that a little bit, the reason I mentioned partial trajectories is because we wanted to cluster on not just complete trajectories or like full gameplay experiences, but at any point in time, can we cluster the particular player with what we have and formulate some sort of understanding? So we could do both with this this approach that I'm going to be describing now. Yeah, hopefully that answers your question, and hopefully the rest will be illuminated in a few moments.
Thanks. Yep.
Cool. So in order to get around this issue of like varying length, some trajectories are longer than others, some people die quicker or longer, whatever, we utilize an autoencoder approach. So, all this messy trajectories go into the autoencoder, and they get squeezed down into a particular latent embedding, which is of a dimension that we can define. Right? This can be a fixed size of whatever we want. And then from that, it needs to then be decoded back up into your original, messy trajectories. Just a standard autoencoder type of framework. But what is beneficial of this approach is that with these latent encodings, we can then cluster them using, again, like I said, those traditional clustering techniques. And it is hoped through, the learning process of that autoencoder that these embeddings represent the initial information that is required to represent that complex trajectory. So we hope that it has all the, the characteristics that uniquely made that trajectory. But now it's perfectly clusterable because it's nice uniform dimension. And with those clusters on the encodings, well, the encoding just maps to a trajectory, and therefore for free we can get the clustered trajectories out of that. Now, more formally, this model looked like this. So we used what is called an LSTM autoencoder, where each time step in your trajectory is kind of chopped up and sequentially fed into individual LSTM cells, and each of these cells passes a result to its subsequent cell, as well as a context. This context kind of represents like a history or memory. So this is like the precursors to kind of how like transformer models work. So this LSTM encoder then passes its output through a fully connected layer. This layer represents our latent space. That latent space then goes through a repeat layer, which essentially says whatever that vector is, just duplicate it for however many times we need to get the same. Well, the original input trajectory had a length, let's say n, right? And the repeat layer just duplicates the latent space vector n times. And the reason for this is we want to reconstruct that trajectory. So we need to know how many cells, how many LSTM cells we need to roll out such that we get the same dimensions as the input. And then this like component is trained in isolation, right, to try and minimize that loss between the input trajectory and the reconstructed trajectory. So here, an autoencoder, like your X and your Y are basically the same thing. So you can do like a mean squared error or any form of like intelligent error between input trajectory and reconstructed trajectory, and that forms your loss. And then once training is completed, well, now we can encode all the trajectories we want, and then just do trajectory clustering on the encoded space, which is really, really useful. Now, I have seen some papers that incorporate a clustering loss directly into your like reconstruction loss. We didn't do that in our own work. We tried to do it, but it didn't seem to help with convergence too much. But I have seen in other less complex domains, it has been used. So that's something to consider. We also wanted to, so a lot of this work was done before like ChatGPT and stuff like that came out. And like before transformers were very popular. I think redoing this architecture using a transformer would also work really well. But yeah. Some quantitative results. Here we compared against a couple different baselines. The non-learning baselines can be seen on the left, so like a random baseline, and then using a custom RSME baseline, so root squared mean error. And here we do what most papers do in the sense that we either pad trajectories such that they're all the same length, or we cut off ends of trajectories to get to a fixed length. So you can see when we're doing like a lot of this, I would say, naive data augmentation, the performance is very, very bad, just about better than random. And then with our approach, you can see that based on a different clustering algorithm, you would also get slightly different performance. So we used Gaussian mixture models and k-means, but the performance is a lot better, like 60 to 70% accuracy when it comes to like the labels to predict the clusters. And here we can actually calculate an accuracy because we generated this data for these two environments, the grid worlds and the mini dungeons one. So because we generated the data, we know what playstyle encoded the data, and therefore we can do the accuracy check on that. You'll note Mario isn't here again because that was a natural data set with human participants, and therefore we don't have these ground truth labels.
Sorry, can I just ask that for the synthetic data, how did you parameterize the playstyles? Were you able to sort of have them very distinct, or was there some continuum of playstyles? In which case, how did you measure sort of how far apart the clusters were?
Yeah. So I'll get onto that, but in general, we trained RL agents which represented each individual playstyle. So each agent had its own reward function, and we trained that to convergence, and then we collected the data during training. and that formed the particular like playstyle centric agents data set. And that was basically true for both grid worlds and mini dungeons. Mini dungeons has like you can just pull these off the repo, predefined policies for different playstyles. So we just use those ones.
Presumably there's some sort of overlap within
Yes.
the playstyles. They're not entirely distinct, and one playstyle will be in some sense closer to another than to a third.
Yes, that's 100% true. When we get into like the interpretability process that I'll touch on soon, I'll show you how how that looks in a second.
Thanks.
Now over here, I also have this additional column with online k-means, online GMM. And this is if we wanted to do the clustering on at each time step within our trajectories, not just the complete trajectory, but at each time step within it, hence the partial trajectories. And the idea here is that while you're playing, you're generating new data. You might not have gotten to one of these terminal states, goal states. Can we accurately identify your playstyle at any point along that path? And what you can see here is obviously the accuracy goes down a bit. But a little bit to what you were asking there, it's like, aren't there some similarities with these playstyles? Yes, there are, and that's what sometimes hampers this like online performance, this online accuracy. Here you can just see some. This is more, I guess, a qualitative result. But here you can see the clustering assignments as we move through a particular trajectory. Or two trajectories rather. You can see they're different lengths. The one only had like 19 time steps and the one below had 70 time steps. And at each point in time, this is what our model thinks the cluster or the playstyle should be. Now, what's really cool about this, and you'll see it in a few moments as well, is that at these points where it shifts, right, there's a bit of noise here, right, essentially, like it goes up and down maybe a little bit. But where these points are shifting from, say, cluster 3 to cluster 0, this is actually like a decision point where if I go left or if I go right, I'm actually playstyle 0 or playstyle 3. So definitely as the trajectory moves along, based on the sequence of actions, you could be one of many different playstyles. But as more and more data is collected, it concentrates towards one particular playstyle at the very end. And we can see this convergence in these figures here, where in the beginning, the start state is the same for all the trajectories for the same level. So obviously each playstyle will start in the same states, and a lot of the early states will be shared. And therefore you see this, like, let's say, confusion or this uncertainty where the model isn't certain if you're like red, green, purple, or blue. For all the different playstyles, it also has that uncertainty. But over time, as we get more and more information, it converges to blue, red, purple, or green in this case. Yeah. Cool. Now, again, this type of model learning, getting these accuracies, standard stuff, I would say. What was clever about our work is the use of the autoencoder to get around the limitations of these varied length trajectories. And again, the main thing is that we really didn't want to do padding because we felt that type of data augmentation was very domain specific, and ultimately it corrupts the data, right? It completely changes the nature of the data. But the other aspect of this is, once we know what cluster you are, that's great. But now we just know you to be, playstyle 0 or 3 or 2. There's nothing there, really. There's no information. What we want is, to have some understanding. Like, this is a diagram from Super Smash Brothers that clusters different characters into different types of roles. And ultimately, we would like something similar to this, where we have this understanding of what it means to be like a rush down player or a hit and run player or trapper or something like that. So a large portion of the research was trying to solve this or figure these things out. Now, as I said, since we designed this particular grid world environment, we knew what the desired behaviors should be, right? So one behavior was to go from the start directly to the goal. One behavior was to go from the start to B1 and then the goal, to go to B2, then the goal, to go to B1, then B2, then the goal, right? So we wanted to develop some sort of methodology that was able to generate this type of behavioral understanding of what it meant to be like, you know, playstyle 1, playstyle 2, playstyle 3, and playstyle 4. So the first step of that is, you know, to continue on with what is done in literature, and that is to identify the characteristics of the cluster. Now, what is traditionally done is you do you know standard mean variance checks across all the features that exist within the different clusters at a state level. We like that makes sense and all, but we wanted to take a step forward and try to be able to identify, say, the shared characteristics. So given like trajectory 1 and trajectory 2, what are the commonalities between these two playstyles? What are the differences between these playstyles? And I think most importantly, maybe what are the unique characteristics between these, well, between like a set of playstyles. So again, this adds to what you asked earlier, was like, aren't there similarities that exist between the data in the clusters? Here you can kind of see that, right? Again, each trajectory, you know, had the same starting location. Sorry, so it would have been in this region over here, and each of these maps, each of these what do you call it? Heat maps, you know, have some signal in those regions. However, you will see there are some unique characteristics just through observation, right? So like cluster 1, it's the only cluster to have some signal in this region here. Cluster 3 is the only one to have some like an intense signal in this region here. And now clusters 0 and 2 are quite similar.
I don't think we can see your mouse there.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Oh, no, no, maybe I can. Maybe we were just going too fast. Sorry.
Perhaps, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, so the image on the far right, you know, had a high signal on the top right block. The image in like the middle left had a high signal on the bottom right block. But like the far left and the middle right, there's a lot of similarity there. And if we go back quickly, just a slide here, we can kind of understand that a little bit. Because these two desired behaviors are very similar when you actually think about their trajectories. So here, for this first behavior is to go basically up, right, up. Well, you know, to get to the goal directly, there's like a path to go there. And now with the second behavior, it's just a small divergent or a small detour to pick up B1 and then do the same thing. So, you know, based on the particular level, you know, there are some crossovers that would exist across different playstyles. And I think that's what you can see here in this diagram as well. So this is where, you know, again, literature tends to stop, you know, at like state frequency analysis. But like I said, we wanted to look at unique characteristics and differing characteristics and shared. So how we do unique is we basically take a particular, you know, playstyle, and we subtract the sum of all the frequencies across the other states, or sorry, across the other playstyles. So if you think you just want to add all these heat maps together and then subtract it from a particular playstyle. And then what you get is this diagram here, which is basically all of these, well, this thing minus all of these things. And you can already see from here in the far left diagram at the bottom right block, that's, again, the only one to have any signal in that region. And what do we get out? Well, you know, that exact same thing. And if you do this for all the other playstyles, you can kind of get an understanding of unique states that, you know, a person who plays like this will encounter. And if the environment was slightly different, you know, where perhaps this region here by B2 was, you know, a monster that you wanted to kill, and the other ones were like a damsel in distress or something, that would, you know, explain away that reasoning. So yeah, that was unique characteristics. This was the same thing, but done across the other two environments, which were, you know, obviously more complex. And the visualization aspect of that is a lot harder. But you can see there's definitely spikes for, you know, each individual playstyle. So playstyle 3 here, which is the blue one, has its own set of spikes. Green has its own set of spikes, and then red has, you know, a smaller set of spikes, but they exist as well. And then again, for an even more complex environment, which is mini dungeons, you can have the same thing. So it's not conclusive, obviously. You still need to go look at what these states themselves mean. But it's a way of identifying what are the most unique states for a particular playstyle. But we didn't just stop there. We did shared, like I say, which is, you know, the commonalities between two ones. And this is just the intersection. So you take like these two heat maps and you intersect them. And then you can get something like this, which makes sense because they both have some signal on these two left-hand side ones. This cluster has some signal on the right-hand side one, but an intersection that will obviously, you know, ignore that part. So that's shared. And then there's similar, like, I want to call it Boolean logic, but like there's similar like a logic like this for differing, when you just take one cluster and you remove another cluster. Okay, so that was the characteristics aspect. What I also alluded on a little bit before was we want to identify playstyle boundaries. So, you know, given a particular playstyle, are there any points in my world where if I do one action, I actually, you know, transition from a particular playstyle into another playstyle? So visually, you can see this in this diagram here, as whenever these squiggly lines like cross over each other, these are points where I could go from being blue to being red, or I could go from being green to being blue or red, in this case, the bottom-ish middle here. But what are the regions or the locations that represent a boundary or transition between one playstyle and another? And how we calculated this was basically, if I scroll back up real quick to this diagram here, it was to look for where the model was, you know, in one direction very confident and in another direction very unconfident. And this tended to be around these transitions between one playstyle to another playstyle. So if I just come back real quickly, we have some diagrams here to hopefully illuminate this a little bit. And the boundary positions are represented by the green squares. So if you're looking, just to clarify, you can see my mouse?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Makes sense.
So in the environment here, we have what we call like a corridor, where there is like impassable terrain on left and right, which kind of forces you down this lane. And now when you get to the end of the corridor, there's a very obvious like binary decision here, right? To do, well, like you could go back, I guess, but do I go left or do I go right? Okay. And the heat map here basically represents how confident it is in its belief that it is a particular playstyle. So if I think I'm playstyle 1 and I go left, you can see the brightness or like the heat map value goes up, the signal goes up. And that means it's getting more and more confident in its belief that it is playstyle, you know, 1 or whatever. And then if I go right, the temperature goes down and it's getting, you know, less and less confident. And the reason for this is, for this particular playstyle, the the true behavior that is underlying is for it to go left, okay? And therefore, if I go right, that means I'm not acting as the actual underlying behavior. So this must mean I am something else, right? Some sort of other playstyle. So the regions we're really looking for are where it's like a high signal to one direction or a low signal in another direction. And you can see that in this like top right area here as well. You can see it's very confident in what it is, or who he is, shall we put it, or who the player is. And therefore, there's no decision boundary here, right? Like it just knows, like, okay, I'm super confident in what I am, or what this trajectory represents. But there's other regions where, again, like if I'm less confident in one direction, I'm more confident in another direction. So this is a way of using our clustering accuracy as a measure of confidence of a particular playstyle, such that we can get the boundaries. And this is this algorithm that we developed. It's not super intuitive, and I understand that. And I'm happy to answer questions on it. There is a full explanation in the one paper that has the algorithm as well. So yeah. Okay. And then lastly, when it came to identification of playstyle, we wanted to look at like what is the general behavior or the mean playstyle. You know, we have, or you can imagine there's 1,000 different trajectories that all somewhat correspond to the same playstyle. Can we identify like the mean essence of what it means to be, you know, playstyle 1, 2, or 3? So again, here in the, like lots of squiggly blue lines, is there one like, you know, strand that connects them all type of thing? And we were able to achieve this. And again, it goes back to like the nature of our architecture. Since we encoded our vectors into this nice embedding or latent space, and then did the clustering, well, you know, clusters have centroids. Whether using GMMs or k-means, dbScan less so, of course. But we can utilize this idea of a centroid to generate a mean playstyle. So if, the intuition here is that, you know, if the data we're clustering represents trajectories, cool. That means that the centroid of that cluster must represent like the middle trajectory, right, or the mean in this like spherical space. Well, then if we decode that middle or centroid trajectory, what do we get? Well, it turns out that we get like the mean playstyle, or like the most common behavior. So here you can see that behavior like emerging. So this is like our start state. We go up, we go left and then up, and then we kind of teleport, but it's because this B state is changing, this B1 state. After we move on to B1, this becomes 0. So we're actually down here. Then we move to the right, we go up through that corridor, and then we go right again, and then we collect B2. So now B1 and B2 is 0. And then we go back up and we go to the goal. So this actually corresponds to the behavior of going from the start to B1 to B2 to then the goal. And this was really cool to see, because this was, you know, just by finding the encoded vector that was closest to our centroid. Now you can actually decode the centroid itself, but it's not guaranteed that the centroid exists within your data set, right? So it might, well, not that it might not look great, it didn't look great. But if you find the trajectory closest to your centroid, and this is what we got, which looks really nice. So yeah.
I think there's a question there from Ben.
Sorry, I don't see any hands up like on my side here. I just literally have my presentation on my screen. So
okay, no problem. Thanks for the great presentation, Branden. I'm Ben Cowley from University of Helsinki. I'm just wondering,
nice to meet you.
And maybe you just now answered this question perhaps, but yeah, just thinking, is it guaranteed that you can get a valid trajectory from the statistical characteristics of your clusters.
It's definitely not guaranteed from literally calculating the centroid and then decoding the centroid. That won't guarantee a correct trajectory. But we found, like I said, if you look at what the centroid is, and from your embedded vectors, find which one is closest to that, and then decode that one, then you get what I'm showing you now.
Yeah, okay. And just to elaborate my question a bit, this may have never come up for your case, but I'm just thinking in terms of usefulness of other uses of the methodology. So what about other statistical characteristics of the clusters? Let's say something like an outlier. So now you don't have a lot of trajectories, true trajectories around it, because it's not a centroid. Would it be possible to then find something that can be representative of statistical characteristic like that, but still valid in game space?
I don't see why not, right? So instead of taking like the vector closest to your centroid, you take the vector furthest away. Now, what you do find is that in this like latent space of cluster trajectories, that the clusters are somewhat overlapping. We did some experiments where we projected it down like using PCA to try like visualize what this latent space looks like. You can think of it as like four clouds almost that are somewhat overlapping at different positions. So even if you find the furthest latent embedding away from your centroid, it will be a valid trajectory, but it might not be a valid trajectory for that playstyle. Does that make sense?
Sorry, yeah, that makes sense. I have kids here as well, so
no problem. I'm glad they're excited about it.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Cool. One little caveat onto that, sorry, is that depending on what your autoencoder reconstruction loss is, you might get some noise added onto that. So yeah, you can be wary, but it would be as a result of the autoencoder loss. Yeah, cool. I can see I am, closing in on time here, so I will go through the next couple of components a little bit quicker. So the first component there was like, what are the different ways to play? But for our advice generation system, we wanted to know what are the different, the best ways to play in each of these styles. So we wanted to learn a set of play style centric agents. So what is the optimal hero? What is the optimal monster hunter? These types of things. And there's a couple ways to do this. One way is to use like IRL on the clustered trajectory. So the individual partitions are fed into like an IRL model. Another technique which we used in the end was behavioral cloning. It has its limitations, I'm not going to lie. But what we did in the end was just use behavioral cloning to train individual policies off of these individual segmented data sets. So formally, this is given a set of trajectories D, can we separate them into K distinct partitions from which we can generate policy pi K, which exhibits the behavior identified by the playstyle K. So in essence, we take our trajectories that are now clustered, we separate them into partitions. That's in this like A step. We then rank order them based on some sort of metric that is specific to the game. So in like mini dungeons and grid worlds, it was like the length of the trajectory. You're more optimal if you do the trajectory if the trajectory is shorter. For Mario, there's like an actual score metric within the game, and that's what we used in the end. And then we take like the top K percent or the top P%, and then train a model using behavioral cloning with that. And what you get out of that is like now a model that exhibits the behavior of the data that is trained on. And you're hoping that because this cluster behavior now, these cluster trajectories are for a particular style of play, that the agent that you, or the policy that you learn exhibits that same style of play as well. So here's just some results demonstrating that we got reasonably good performance in the different environments. So the blue line is like our model that used the clustering. We also did some techniques without clustering, and of course just a random baseline. And what was interesting to see was that we could also train agents that perform at different skill levels. So if we feed in all the trajectories within a partition, we can still get high performance in terms of our like model accuracy. But if we only train on like the top 10% of the trajectories, we can still get a high performing or like good accuracy. The behaviors here will be different between the model trained for this level here and this one. So in essence, like if you think of it in terms of chess, by training on the 0.1, that's like grandmaster model will be trained. And then training on all the data sets, then a novice agent will be trained. This was more of a side benefit of our approach. But yeah, we explored this a little bit. And then in the end of the day, we have like some policies now that like exhibit like expert behavior. So our blue playstyle agent is one that just goes directly to the goal. And you can see the policy here is just like Manhattan distance its way to the goal. Playstyle 2 was to go to B1 in the goal. The purple playstyle was then B2 to the goal. And then the red playstyle was to collect both of them and then go to the goal.
Can I just ask, so
yeah.
within a given playstyle here, you've now found a sort of optimal behavior. So the sort of
Yes.
Manhattan walk there for playstyle 1. Is there anything interesting to be said for looking at the players that have playstyle 1 and to see how far away from optimal they are within that? So to sort of subcategorize. So to see, for instance, somebody who goes directly to it, but is doing so in a slightly different sort of movement pattern, that sort of thing. Is there any value to be found in that?
Yes, there is, exactly right. More so in improving learning rates. So if I have this like gold standard version of a particular playstyle, and we have some desire for this other, let's say not pi star, but like some pi plus or something like that, right? We now have like a guide that can be used to indicate to this like suboptimal model how to get better. And that was the whole purpose of the research. And yeah, I'll be closing in on that in a second. And this is it. So the last components, like the last main model, was to figure out how like you as an individual play. So we know the different ways to play. We know the best ways to play in each of those ways, but we don't know how you play. All right. So this was, again, just a simple LSTM network that was trained to predict like future states. So yeah, given some partial trajectory X or complete trajectory, as well as a cluster identifier, so like what playstyle we've identified you as, can we predict your next action or your next state, which is like a state action pair. And for that, we just had this like CAP model, as like cluster assisted prediction model. So a trajectory is, we identify the cluster of this current trajectory that goes through some gating mechanism, which like activates like a sub model. And then the trajectory follows into the activated model, and then it predicts some output. But you can think of it as just like some sort of supervised learning approach. And for different environments, we got some performance. So our CAP model, like 0.56, it wasn't super. It wasn't amazing results. I was a little bit disappointed in it. But again, these are results on like an online training. So with very minimal trajectories, with like 5 trajectories, can we get some sort of accuracy? So you can see compared to random, it's obviously better than random, but there might be some other models that are better than it still. Again, this was multiple things coming together for a larger goal. I wasn't necessarily trying to reinvent player modeling at this point, at least. One thing we did notice, at least, was that for each of these like predictor submodels, they do specialize on the playstyle that they're specifically trained to, specialize on. And we can see that here. So H0 is like a subset of trajectories for playstyle 0, and M0 is like the model for 0. And then you can see on the diagonal, that's where all the best results are. So it does at least try to optimize for the correct playstyle. And here again, we do see some results when we use pre-training versus no pre-training. And our pre-training model dramatically outperformed the no pre-training model. And again, the episode at the bottom here is literally like number of trajectories we use to train. So it's very few. And the reason for that is we hypothesize at least that, if we want to use this in a live setting, you can't be spending years gathering data from individuals before the model has some sort of understanding of them. So we wanted to get this huge spike as quick as possible. Yeah. Cool. And then the last thing is, how should you play to get better? Like, now we understand you a little bit, like how can we give you advice? And this is actually, to your question that you asked a few seconds ago. So what we use is like model comparison to, formulate some advice and send that to the user. So as like a particular user is playing, they're making actions, the world is changing, and they're receiving this feedback. We record this information. So like the partial trajectories idea with our pre-trained model, as you saw before. And it's hoped that in an online fashion, we can fine-tune our player model to emulate the same action sequence that you would do. So we can select like an optimal version of yourself. So again, a player interacts, we gather the partial trajectory while they're interacting, we encode it, we cluster it. And again, we can encode any length trajectories, right? So any length of that partial trajectory is fine. We say, oh, you're the red player. And because we know who you are, we can assign the optimal red player to you. And then we just do the model comparison. So if you say left and the expert said left, well, all good. If you say up and the model said up, all good. But if there's this like disparity, then the model will give you advice. In this case, it was quite simplistic. It's just like the action you should take given this particular state, or this like sequence of states. So the model would return like, oh, you should go right. Now, the one limitation to this, this was all happening really close to the end of the research, was that we didn't test this on like a human study, but we did simulate like human archetypes. So the archetypes are kind of represented here. So we created trajectories that, or a set of trajectories that don't share play styles or skill level. So they're just essentially the user data set only contains trajectories of non-shared play styles or skill level, so random. The next one is that the user data set had a fixed fixed skill level, which we could do with the filtering that I showed you before. Sorry, these should be the opposite way around. In general, like fixed skill, random play style, and the opposite, like random skill, fixed play style. And then the last one was that they have a fixed skill and a fixed play style. So beforehand, we know that they're like a high-performing, low-performing, medium-performing for a particular style. And then with these archetypes, we kind of simulated their trajectories, and then we got some results like this. So if our like simulated agents never took advice, well, then their accuracy or their performance never really changes over, say five trajectories, or 4 in this case, sorry. And if they take the advice like 50% of the time, well, then they do improve. And if they take advice 100% of the time, they improve even more. But what's really nice to see is that the graphs that do the best are the ones that have a set skill, a set play style. So that's red and orange. And because they have a set skill, a set play style, our model can take advantage of that, right? Because we do all this big schlep of identifying play styles and then training models that leverage the idea that we know what play style you are. And so here's like a really telling like closing story, like to indicate that this advice generation program or system, which is able to identify your playstyle, helps you train or helps you get better quicker than if you have if playstyle wasn't important. So yeah.
Can I just ask, shouldn't there be overlaps in them all at the 0 episode level? So, for instance, the blue line, shouldn't they all kind of look similar at 0?
So the reason that they don't, right? Again, sorry, let me just think this through. Okay, so because we're still using like our whole pipeline when we're doing this training or this like experimental process, right? Based on the individual trajectories, again, there's only like 5 or so. You can get like initial starting state variance.
But shouldn't you get some? So I would expect variance, but I would expect overlap in the variance if you're doing them sort of multiple times.
That is true. I'll have to think about that one.
Sure. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yes.
That is a good point. Let me think on that one.
Sure. Thanks.
Cool. So yeah, I just want the last figure, I think it is, and just zooming in a little bit on this just so you can see. Again, the human analogs that have fixed playstyles do better than the ones that don't have fixed playstyles, is the closing remark on that. So in conclusion, a little bit of a pixelated version of my model, I don't know why. This was like the main output of the research, this complete pipeline. In terms of future work and stuff like that, literally every one of these components I feel can get better, using transformers, applying like maybe convolutions onto things so we can train from pixels, using IRL again for the game modeler, even though we did use that and that was very, very bad. Looking at the scheduling, we didn't really focus too much on when to give advice. We also didn't really focus too much on like the form of the advice, and when using human studies, I think that's very important. But in general, like it was nice to see that the whole pipeline somewhat worked in the end, which I'm really happy about. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. I know I chatted for quite a while. So if there are any additional questions, I'm happy to answer them now.
Cool. Thank you so much, Branden. That was super, super interesting. Are there any questions from anybody?
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah, go right
I
ahead.
wanted to ask why, just briefly, why the inverse reinforcement learning didn't quite work.
Yeah, so the reason I think it doesn't work is that because we collected trajectories during the entire course of training, right? There's a large diversity in those trajectories, right? And this basically results in noise when it comes to the IRL training pipeline. And IRL does not like noise at all when it's trying to recapture that fundamental policy that generated the data. What maybe could be done is that you heavily partition the trajectories that you feed into the IRL model. And maybe that would work. but IRL is like a very long training process in itself, right? Because it's like that two-step thing where you learn the model, then you have to use that model to then infer the correct rewards, and then you do the comparison on that. So as soon as you start getting into like larger dimensional, domains, I think IRL is also quite limited in that front. We tried IRL in the taxi domain, which is, we know it should work in that, but it didn't work for this style of research.
And if you were to use just state visitation frequencies as your reward, and have some sort of cutoff in terms of so if you have a minimal cutoff in your frequency and just use those state visitation frequencies as the raw rewards, could you use that for IRL?
What do you mean by using the state frequency or the state visitation frequency?
So
instead of having a trajectory, you count the number, or like you generate a frequency for all the states in that trajectory, and then just feed that in?
Yeah, exactly. But so you would presumably want to, because you want to get rid of the noise, you want to take the states that this sort of agent frequently goes to, and just have those as highly weighted rewards.
That may work. Yes, that may work. The one thing that you do lose by doing that is like the temporal consistency. So there is, like in some domains at least, there is very correct reasons why you'll like retread the same path.
Right.
Say you go to a door and you pick up a key and then you come back out that door.
Right.
I don't know if that type of information is then lost and you can't regenerate the policy from that.
You could probably sort of turn it into a Markovian process, so you store some past state information about what has already happened.
Yeah, you could use some sort of memory for key features. Then you would have to design that though,
Sure.
and you have to design that for each of the domains. Yeah. But could work definitely.
Cool.
Yeah, nice question.
Any other questions? So I think that's a lot of information to take. Ben, go for it.
One short question here. Branden, have you thought about the fact that the playing style is not stationary? So if you think of it as a time series over the gameplay.
Yes. No, I mean, that's true. It just is the nature of like, it's your playstyle might change across a level or even at like a macro scale, like over time, right? Like as you get better at the game, your playstyle might change. What I think is useful for what this approach is that it has that online training loop where as we get in more data from a user, sure, there might be a bit of hesitation for the model to shift completely into another playstyle based on like some sort of history that it's gotten. But as we get more and more data representing this new playstyle, let's call it, or these new trajectories, the model will transition with that, with some lag, of course. There's things you could do to circumvent that, where you have like a separate model that starts training every new time you start playing a game, and then you use that to compare against the old one. And if there's a large enough disparity, well, then maybe you just take this new model. So there are things that can be done like that.
I think that the areas of study of concept drift and concept shift are like as old as data mining itself. So I don't know. I don't follow them. I expect they're probably also very kind of what's the word I'm looking for? They're probably as rich as the models we have today. As you were saying, there's a lot of good stuff out there. But I'm more sort of slightly interested in the idea that there would be something like play patterns at a finer granularity than play style. And that somebody might just shift between these play patterns, which represent particular ways of doing things, particular ways of solving problems, which might be game specific or not. I mean, it depends on the design of the game. But how do you think your pipeline could relate to that concept of like learning more granular identities and then maybe sort of stringing them together, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, I think from an RL background, that sounds like option learning in a way. We obviously didn't do that. But I think if you want to do like a hierarchical approach like that, well, then, you know, you can self-segment the trajectories that you have and then just cluster them as individual things, I think. So that if I go maybe way back, you know, so if I look at this one, right, it's like this, the model is quite confident that the particular player exhibited you can see my slide, sorry?
Yep. Yeah.
So the model is quite confident that it was like at this point in time, the player was exhibiting cluster 3's behavior. And again, that could be that like granular, like behavioral pattern that you were talking about. And this could be like, oh, I went to the left, like room or something like that. And then after a period of time like that changed, right? Like there was like a new granular pattern that we saw. So perhaps if you want to use this model, then it would just be to look at a graph like this and just group each of the states that, or just group the set of states where the model was confident in it being a particular play style. So we would group like this bottom region together as like a pattern, this top region here was a pattern, and then this other like more top region was a pattern. And then like similar to this maybe shorter trajectory, like we'd group the top, the bottom, and then the middle. And those could be like patterns of behavior. And actually for this one particularly, it is like if you look how this is represented in the world, like this is to go left to that other region. This is to go like up into the corridor. And then this is to go like left towards the goal. So you can definitely see these behaviors, you know, from this type of clustering graph, like this clustering over time.
So I think I'm going to have to wrap things up, but I think there may be more to discuss, particularly with Ben at some point. Maybe we can arrange for a time to chat. But thank you.
Sounds
thank you
great.
so much.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you so much, Branden, for a really fascinating talk. Yeah, we hope to be able to continue this discussion and hope to catch up with you soon. And thank you, everybody, for coming along. Wonderful.
Yeah, that was a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Pleasure. Cheers. Bye, everyone.
Cheers, everyone.